Yes, okay. All right, thank you for coming to this seminar. I'm delighted to be talking about this topic. So as Arati said, my background has been in mainly programming languages and software engineering. Digital inclusion in later life is something that I got interested in a few years ago, and it takes up quite a lot of my time at the moment. So the particular topic I want to talk about today are digital literacy needs of older adults. So first of all, I would like to start with some acknowledgements. So there are a lot of people who have worked with me on this, collaborators, student interns, as well as project students. We have been working with some community partners who have been absolutely vital to this work, and obviously the participants in our studies who have really taken this to heart and worked with us very enthusiastically in what we've been trying to do. Right. Am I going to have to?
I'll deal with those. Yeah, I'll join and I'll deal with that.
Right. So just to give you some context, I think this is something that wouldn't come as a surprise to many of you. So we are going through the phenomenon of population aging. This is happening in Scotland, this is happening in the UK, and it's happening globally. So the Scottish and UK numbers are for 2023, and the percentages are set to increase in the next few decades. Globally, the percentage of older people is set to increase in the next few decades as well. So this is something that's acknowledged as a global phenomenon, and we need to think about what that means for us as a society and how we can better support older adults in our communities. So one of the factors that we have to think about in the context of continuing digitalization is the correspondence between age and digital technology use. So here are some figures for the UK. So 18% of people 65 and over, and 29% people 75 and over in the UK do not use the internet. So this is according to a briefing that was published by the charity Age UK, which does a lot of work with older people. And the Lloyds Bank Consumer Digital Index says that nearly 9 out of 10 of those people who are classed as very low in digital capability segment are actually 50 and over. So one thing to mention here, so the definition of older is not set in stone. So for the purpose of our work, we have tended to treat people who are 60 and over as older. You will find in literature definitions that say 65. There are other factors that determine some of the digital adoption considerations. So there are no hard and fast rules on this. There might be people who are 50 and over who are already experiencing some challenges. If they have other circumstances that affect their dexterity, for example, the challenges could start much earlier. So these are all numbers that are probably not entirely surprising. The interesting thing to note is that digital technology use among older adults is increasing. It's increasing slowly, but it's not keeping pace with the pace of digitalization, and that is one of the problems. It used to be thought that this was a problem, to put in a milder way, that we could wait out, right? That there are generations that are growing up with digital technology. We already have the so-called digital natives who are adults now. And when they reach older age, they will be able to cope fine with technology. But studies have shown that that is not the case, that they wouldn't be entirely comfortable necessarily, because there are two factors affecting that. One is that the effects of aging still happen. So some of the challenges arise not because people haven't grown up with technology, but because of the impact of aging. So things like dexterity and deterioration in vision and reflexes, and memory capacity, and also the ability to focus for particular lengths of time. So those effects are going to continue. We haven't found a way to reverse aging yet. And also, the other factor is that technologies change very fast. So even if you're very comfortable using technology at a certain point in time, by the time you get to an older age and some of the effects of aging start to appear, and if technologies keep changing fast, you might have trouble keeping up with the changes. So this is not a problem that's going to go away. So this is something we have to consider. So just for interest, if we think about then the demographics of software developers, globally, over 81% of software developers are aged 18 to 44, and the largest number falling within the range of 25 to 34. Again, this probably wouldn't be a surprise to you. And so that is a global figure. BCS released a report a few years ago, and that said that 22% of IT specialists, so IT specialists, they are not necessarily software developers, and around 10% of web designers and developers in the UK were 50 or over. So the vast majority of people who are developing digital resources and services are not in the demographic that's increasing. Okay, so that is not to say people are entirely unaware of the challenges, but they may not be experiencing the same sort of challenges. So we have to make a special effort to keep in mind the challenges that might be experienced by different groups other than the ones that developers might belong to. So this basically leads us to the idea of digital divide. So this is again something that we would all have heard about in different contexts. So this is the gap between the people who have access to digital technologies and resources and are able to use them efficiently and confidently and attain the outcomes that they want from them, and those who don't for whatever reasons. So there's kind of the haves and have-nots, and that is the divide. And there are some figures that suggest that the gap is widening, but it's not a straightforward single factor issue. So there are multiple reasons why the divide might exist, and we can look at these. Again, literature might suggest different levels. So there are some papers that will talk about 2 different levels. There are some papers that talk about 4 different levels. So we are going to focus on one that mentions 3 in the middle. So the first one is kind of a fundamental thing. So people don't have access to the devices and infrastructure. So you don't have access to broadband. You don't necessarily have the right kind of devices that can give you access. That is something that's fundamental. You have to have that before you go on to anything else. Level 2 pertains to the case where you might have right kind of devices. You might have broadband. You have good network access, but you still lack either the knowledge or the skills or the confidence or the motivation to make use of digital technologies effectively and efficiently. So that is a huge area. So it's one level, but it covers a multitude of factors. The third one talks about tangible outcomes. So even if you have access to devices and infrastructure, even if you have the literacy and the motivation, whether you achieve the tangible outcomes that you want from digital technology can depend on other factors. So these first 2 levels are necessary. So each one is necessary for the next one, but it's not necessarily sufficient. So the third one is about outcomes and what factors. For example, socioeconomic status might impact whether you are able to achieve everything you want out of digital technology. So thinking about these digital divide, most literature suggests that age is a significant factor in all of these levels of divide. Okay, so that is kind of my focus here. And I'm particularly interested in the level 2 divide. So a lot of the work that governments and councils do is focused on level 1, because that is fundamental. You have to have that. And it's best done by governments and larger organizations in terms of making devices and infrastructure available. The level 2 is still a significant problem, and it's an open problem, and that's the one we've been focusing on. So what happens currently? There's a lot of work still being done. It's continuing to be done, a lot of great work. So one strategy is online learning. So there are courses available, there are resources available, there are videos that show you how to do things. So people can go online. And so University of the Third Age, Tech Life Unity, it used to be called Tech Boomers, I think, Learn My Way, etc. So these are some examples. You can imagine there are a lot more. So online learning is one strategy. There are organizations, charities, tech companies that produce resources and offer support, different kinds of support. So the charities mentioned tend to have more in-person support. Okay, so they might actually send people for one-to-one sessions to offer help. And obviously, there are lots of online resources produced by tech companies as well as the charities. And then you have classes and workshops, perhaps more locally organized by governments, councils, charities, volunteers, community groups, etc. So these all happen. You can imagine some of the challenges. So if somebody is scared to go online, they're struggling to get online, to tell them to go and learn something online, there is immediately a barrier to entry. Okay, so that doesn't work. If you're at a certain level of literacy, then that's a good maybe option, but it doesn't work for everyone. Similarly, for guidance, resources, and support, one of the things we have found is that the needs are so varied. Not everybody has the same level of understanding, the same kind of need. So if you produce generic resources, that will be fine for some people, but not everybody. And the one-to-one or in-person support that's offered by charities works really well, but you can imagine it doesn't scale too well. Okay. So in terms of classes and workshops, again, if they are not aimed at older people, that doesn't work as well. So we talked to a group, they said they had a lovely person who came and talked to them for 2 hours on how to do something. This is a group of 50 plus people. I think about 25 of them. They said after about 15 minutes, most people couldn't keep up because they were just talking at these people for 2 hours, and it's not a format that works for older people in general. And so those are kind of broader initiatives. And we also have government strategies on this because it's recognized as a problem. This is happening globally, but certainly locally as well. So the UK government just published the Digital Inclusion Action Plan. So if you haven't looked at it, you might want to, because they are looking for feedback on this at the moment. So there's a consultation process. If you're interested in this area, I think the consultation stays open until early April. So you might want to look at that and give some feedback. So that's very recent. And then the Scottish government had a digital policy and a digital strategy for Scotland, 2021 or thereabouts. So this is a few years old now. Both of these recognize the particular challenges faced by some groups of people. So they both identify older people as one of the groups that might be particularly impacted by this, people with disabilities, people on the lower socioeconomic status and that sort of thing. And interestingly, they both identify the need for level 1 and level 2 digital divides being addressed. But the scale is interesting because level 1 can perhaps be addressed on a wider scale, but even then we can see that sometimes it doesn't quite hit the mark. Level 2 is very hard to do on that huge wide scale. So that is something we have to look at. So one of the things that can happen is what happened here. So around the time of COVID, this was a good thing to do, right? So COVID hit relatively suddenly. People had to make changes relatively suddenly. The government realized there were lots of people who were disconnected in some way and unable to reach the help they needed, their families, etc. So the Scottish government had this initiative called Connecting Scotland, and within a fairly short period of time, they distributed a lot of devices to households. So all the adults were who might have been shielding were one of the groups identified as needing this support. So they distributed a lot of devices and they tried to set up some support. So these were not trivial things. So Chromebooks and iPads were handed out. And I spoke to a charity that said, we wish they had talked to us first. And you can imagine, there was a time pressure. It was emergency. They had to do something. So they did this. But in practice, a lot of the people who got these devices didn't know how to use them. They couldn't access the online support that was being given. So I spoke to a charity who said their volunteers eventually went to some of these houses and some of these devices were being used as trays. Or, I mean, they were just kept there or given to other family members who could make use of them. People could not get started with that. So on a much more local level, what did happen was something like this. So this happened, I know this happened in St. Andrews as well. This is a community-based organization. Basically, they connected Raspberry Pis to some people's TV. There was very little learning required. So this was to enable people who were shielding at home to stay connected to their local community. This cost £79 for a year, whereas the ones that were being done here cost hundreds of pounds, if not more. Okay, so the charities were understanding of what was trying to be done, but also really frustrated because they felt this was a waste of resources. So the levels at which we tackle these problems obviously matters quite a lot. So the project here is looking at digital inclusion in later life. And some of the questions that we are trying to answer are the challenges that older adults face in adopting digital technologies, what approaches are helpful to older adults in improving the digital literacy and confidence. So it's not just literacy, it's not just knowledge and skills. Confidence plays a huge part in older adults actually adopting digital technologies and sticking with it. And for us as computer scientists, what do we need to learn from this? How do we develop and deploy solutions that are accessible to the entire age range? So it's a fairly standard research methodology we did. So there's quite a lot of literature on this, but on larger scales. So we did user studies with older adults and younger people. With older adults, there were semi-structured interviews. So we wanted them to talk to us about the problem. So it was very towards the unstructured end of semi-structured. So we had some seed questions and then let them talk to us. We tried to limit their time so that, we wouldn't tire people out or take too much time. Most of the time we overran because they wanted to talk. So they were very glad somebody was asking about this, and they were very happy to engage. So it was very qualitative data. So we mainly did thematic analysis of the responses we had, and we created some prototype resources, and then we went back to people to evaluate what we had produced. So what are the broader insights? There's huge variation in attitudes, abilities, needs, and experiences, as you can imagine. Even though we did fairly small scale studies, even within these small groups, there was huge variation. Interestingly enough, there was acceptance of digitalization. They may not like it, but they accept that this is where things are going, and there are benefits to be had. They see younger family members or neighbors using them effectively. They would like to be able to get those benefits, but they are simply not confident at this point. Okay, so this is where things are going was kind of a repeated comment. So they were accepting of that. And what was also interesting for me was thinking about a lot of the studies were done by my students. So my students would go and talk to older people, come back and say, this is so strange because this is not how I think about things. And then so in terms of what people, how people feel about what's real or not, what's better or not, what's desirable or not. So if you think about money, one of my students came back and said, for them, like notes, currency, hard currency, notes and coins they said, it's like monopoly money. It's not real. What's real to them is what their access is in their bank account. It was almost the exact opposite for older people. For them, what they could hold in their hand was real. What was in some online banking account was like something virtual. This is not real. It's like somebody made up some numbers, but what I have got is the real thing. Same applies for tickets. Older people liked having something they could hold in their hand and say, I have got a ticket. That was very different for younger people in terms of what is desirable. So one of our participants said, my bank is trying to push me to do online banking. And my son says, this is brilliant because, if you go online, you don't have to go to the bank. They said, but I like going to the bank. So if we have people who are developing digital solutions and services, and they are on the much younger scale, and there is this very different perception or preferences about what is real and what is good and what works better. So there is a fundamental mismatch in what we are trying to do. And generic learning resources are not always effective. Generic strategies for digital inclusion are not always effective. So if you don't want people to have to remember passwords, so there are some services that have switched to one-time password. You put in your email address and they will send you something on the phone, and then you put that in. That means you don't have to remember password. Older people hate this. Well, not generalizing. Some older people hate it because they are so scared of coming out of the app they are in to get hold of the one-time password and to go back in. So they often have a friend or their spouse near with another device, so they can get the one-time password and they don't have to come out their window. And then they will say, so I don't know what will happen if something happens to one of us because we can't do this service. And there's such a fear and anxiety about this sort of things that we might not imagine. So the technology acceptance model talks about the factors that affect the acceptance and eventual use of technology by people, and it talks about perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use as two major factors. There are variations on this that include others. Those two, and the interesting thing is it's perceived, right? And our findings say that actually tallies with what people feel. So is this actually going to help me? So they don't necessarily want to use technology for the sake of it. What's the benefit and how easy is it to use? So those are big factors. And overall, what we find is there's a huge need for interdisciplinary approaches. I went into this thinking, computer scientists, if we design the software properly, we design the interfaces properly, all sorts, it really isn't. There is a huge amount of work that needs to be done from different perspectives in how we introduce these things, how we support people, how we explain what's happening, and that we are going to need people from many different disciplines. And this is not something we can do by ourselves as academics or policymakers. We need to work with the people who are going to be using these devices and services in order to come up with effective solutions. So some of the challenges that all the adults face, there's huge amounts. There's obviously an entry barrier for digital support. Use of technical jargon is really off-putting because they don't understand what that means. And also, if this comes up later, it makes them feel like they are not smart enough for this. The huge fear of making mistakes and the consequences of mistakes, both for themselves and for other people. So they might, if I press this button, it might wipe out my bank balance. So really worried about doing that. Also, or it might charge my credit card thousands of pounds. And we have had people say, if I'm really worried, I might delete the internet if I do the wrong thing. So there's fears about themselves and for what they might do to other people. And they feel frustrated. So clearly this is not everybody, because some older people absolutely adore technology. They can't, they have so many gadgets, they're very happy to learn new technologies, but a large proportion of them have these feelings of frustration, being intimidated, and interestingly being patronized, because some of them do have certain level of digital literacy, and then people say, okay, so you click this button, and then they go, I'm not stupid, I know that. So getting the balance right is important. There's a lot of tech anxiety, but also the way services are presented makes them feel, as they call it, stupid. And they will say, I'm not stupid, I've got 2 degrees, but I really struggle with this aspect of it. And lack of allowances made for aging. So some of the factors we talked about, a lot of older adults prefer tablets because they have a larger screen size than smartphones, but they are not as heavy as laptops, whatever. But as you get older, the touch screen doesn't work as well, because I think the skin of older people dries up or something. So the touch screen surfaces don't work as well as you get older. And then they don't necessarily realize this. There's published work on this. So they try and hit it harder, or they say, I can't even do this simple thing. I can't. And they assume it's their fault when the technology isn't adapted to working with older people. And a frequent complaint is about basically things changing fast and without warning. So the workflow changes sometimes. So there is an update that gets installed. They didn't even know it was being installed. Alexander's noting. And then it's like either the look and feel changes completely, or the workflows changed subtly, and what worked yesterday doesn't work anymore. And there's like, why is this happening? It was working. Why do you change something that's already working? So that is a recurring theme. Don't fix something if it's not broken, because I was just getting used to it and you've changed it again. Lack of support. And a huge part of this, I think, fundamental, that was interesting to me, is that there are few opportunities for people to practice using services. The only time they get to do something is when they're using it in anger to actually do something. So there is no safe environment, banking, booking, whatever, where they can actually practice without worrying about the consequences. So banking and transport come up as frequent issues. So the solution strategies, so what can we think about? Producing resources. So one of the things we want to try and do is produce physical resources as a first step before transitioning to digital resources. Okay, so start with something comfortable and familiar and then move people on. Obviously, as computer scientists or developers, we have to be aware of the people whom we are developing things for. So it's producing guidance for developers, producing guidance for service providers on how to deploy, how to introduce and deploy services, engaging with community organizations and charities about how we can scale the solutions, but also giving guidance to younger people on how they support older people. So a lot of the support older people get at the moment comes informally through families and friends, typically grandchildren, nephews and nieces. Apparently spouses and children are kind of second port of call. So when we talk to them, they say they have feelings of guilt, but also frustration because they are repeating the same thing again and again. So in terms of how to support all the adults, I think they need support. So there are different kinds of needs that we have to reconcile here. And some of this might seem contradictory. So for example, people told us about a particular service that was problematic because there was a complex form. It was all on one page. They lost track of where they were. And sometimes these services built, sort of have default values. And people got very confused about who had put the values in, whether they had filled them in, not. So we produced a prototype that was like one thing at a time, very clear. And they said, oh, but it doesn't look like that. Because even though the other one was harder to use, they had got used to it. So something different was actually problematic, even though it was better from their own feedback. So a lot of people feel that there is kind of either too much tech or too little tech. So it's not hitting the right spot. So they are expected to use technology more than they're comfortable with, but it hasn't gone far enough that it's easy to use. So voice-activated devices are actually preferred by older people. You might think that could be scary. They prefer that to having to enter data by hand because voice activation is a lot easier. Assistance versus autonomy. So they really want to keep agency. There's a strong desire to keep their independence, to learn how to do things themselves rather than having to rely on other people. But they do want support when they need it. And again, there is a fine balance. So similarly for support and training. So learning how to do something is better. And in terms of things like the tablet and touchscreen surfaces, that's preferred, but there's a limit in technology that doesn't allow them to use that. And there's peer support. There's some comfort in being with their peers, people of similar age, their friends, learning together, trying to figure things out. But there is also anxiety, particularly about appearing stupid in front of other people. So in terms of discussing problems or potential solutions, people are very happy being in groups. When they want to be trained, they prefer one-to-one training because they want to take it at their own pace and not be under pressure, but what somebody else is doing. So in terms of supporting digital literacy in later life, what do we need to do? Obviously, we have to understand the motivations, what it is that people want to do. So not force tech on them, but allow them to, at their own pace, learn the technology that's going to be most helpful. We have to co-create the resources. There is no way we can independently or unilaterally say, I made this wonderful resource, this is going to solve all your problems, because we have to work with people to understand what it is they want. We want to start with what's familiar and lead up to something that might be less familiar, both in terms of the format and the content. We have to tailor content. So these are open problems. On this scale, how do we tailor things? So we are thinking about the idea of templates, like minimal resources that people can annotate in their own words. So we are thinking about things like that. Keeping humans in the loop is super important. So if it goes entirely offline, entirely tech-based, that's uncomfortable for people. So they really need the reassurance of somebody saying, you're doing this right, or that's you all sorted. That kind of human reassurance is hugely important. So the challenges are what you might expect in terms of scalability, customizability, actually reaching the people who are worst affected. So a lot of the time we recruit people, it happens through email at some point, and there are people without email. There are people without devices. So how do we reach the people who are most affected by it? Where there is the biggest gap. And that is a challenge. So often we kind of have to do snowball sampling. So you go to somebody and say, do you know anyone who's really impacted? And then how do we reach them? And another huge problem is there's so much work happening here in academia, in industry, by governments, councils, charities, community organizations. And there's obviously a risk of duplication. So how do we coordinate these efforts so that we are not wasting time and resources doing the same thing in multiple places, but we just work together to achieve something that's actually significant? And one of the interesting things for us that's come out is needing to get things right early. So in this kind of move fast and break things kind of way of developing, or deploy things with errors, knowing there are errors, we'll fix them when users report them. They are huge turnoffs for older people. If you're going to work with this demographic, it's important to get things right early, otherwise basically they stop engaging. So a quick, I know I'm slightly over the, okay. So in terms of adult learners, so as universities, this is something we have to increasingly think about. There's huge emphasis from the governments at the moment, particularly about upskilling and allowing people to return to work and moving people to sectors that are more in demand. So we have returning students, we have lifelong learners. So we're going to have to think very hard about the levels of digital divide that could be affecting students. And there's a need, obviously, to engage early. Again, if we let them start and then we'll say, wait and see how they cope, and then we'll do something, it might be too late if they are on the sort of in the older range of the age group. And there are risks always of assumptions by others. So my students sometimes came back and said, oh, they know so much. And just because they can't use a particular digital technology doesn't mean they don't know anything. But there's easy to make that sort of assumption because people might not contribute in a digital format. Group settings have to be thought about because of this anxiety, and we have to demystify. So there's a lot of fear of AI at the moment. There's kind of, for older people, it's the Skynet scenario, right? So how do we demystify, sort of what are the advantages, what are the limitations? Obviously, in terms of what we have done, these are small but in-depth studies, and they were fairly local. So we really need to spread out. So my plan immediately is to sort of cover Fife and Tayside as the next stage, but we are looking at collaborations in other areas because it'll be interesting to do comparative studies. The viewers were mainly young adults who were students. It was good in a sense because all the adults loved engaging with younger people, but in terms of how questions were phrased, etc., there might have been some issues. And what we evaluated were basically prototype resources. So these were not well-developed solutions. So some of this I have talked about already. Interested in engaging with policymakers as well. If anybody is interested, if you have any questions, if you'd like to learn more, please feel free to get in touch. I will be very happy to answer and work with people.